very happy to have Max Rietkerk with us today. Max is a full professor of spatial ecology and I think currently head of the Environmental Sciences and Copernicus Institute at Utrecht University. And he is I always thought he was a mathematician by training, but he told me at some point he's not. But I mean, from the kind of work he does, you might think so. So from my viewpoint, Max really works at a very nice interface between ecology, spatial ecology in particular, and applied mathematics. And I'm very much looking forward to this talk, which will be on a very nice, well, I'm not sure if should call it mechanism, but I mean, yeah, maybe a general mechanism for evading tipping in complex systems via spatial pattern formation. I'm very much looking forward to this, Max. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Niklas, for this nice introduction. Indeed, I'm not a mathematician, I'm an ecologist, and I work a lot with mathematicians. That is, I do some mathematics myself as well, as you have seen from my publications. But I collaborate with mathematicians because I think this is really an essential way to look at certain phenomena and, well, to discover certain phenomena also. That would not happen without mathematics. I will come to that during my presentation. Actually, what I would like to do first is I would like to show a short video. So in a moment I will share my screen and show the video. And after that video is finished, I will of course close it, and then I will open my PowerPoint presentation, and I will continue with the PowerPoint presentation. So the first 5 minutes is for a video that I will now show in a minute by sharing my screen and starting the video. So let's see if that all works. I guess it will.
Some organisms are really clever. Plants, for example, improve their own growing conditions by increasing water infiltration. In this way, they can survive in environments that are actually way too dry. But it also makes them prone to suddenly disappear. In the face of alarming global changes, there has been much talk about such tipping points in Earth system elements. A tipping point can exist when the same environmental conditions can support two different possible ecosystem states, such as a vegetated and a barren state. A stable state is like a ball in a valley. If conditions become drier, this can cause the ecosystem to tip to the bare state. Water input then needs to improve a lot more for the vegetation to tip back into the system. A stable state means that when the vegetation is disturbed, there is a bit less, but this is only temporary. When a disturbance is too large and the system ends up below this dotted line, then it tips to a bare state. Plants can return when they do so in large enough numbers. Tipping is not so convenient for us. Healthy ecosystems are important for people, so we like them to be resilient and not prone to sudden large changes. Luckily, the notion of ecosystem tipping depends a lot on the spatial scale that you're looking at. Some organisms, such as plants in dry environments, can form spatial patterns. As the environmental conditions change, the patterns adjust accordingly. Through these pattern adjustments, the vegetation can adjust freely and gradually through what we call a booster balloon, avoiding the tipping point. Organisms, especially trees, do take some time to grow back, so if the climate changes too fast, the system can still tip. These insights are obtained mostly from mathematical, physical and ecological theory, but models are clear, simplified versions of the real world, whereas the world is actually more like a big mess. Such spatial heterogeneity can also cause spatial pattern formation, for example at the border between savannas and tropical forests. You see, plants can be rather selfish. They worsen conditions for plants of another kind. Tropical forest trees block sunlight so that savanna vegetation cannot grow. And savanna vegetation stimulates fire. Savanna trees are adapted to fire, but tropical trees are not. So savanna plants are bad for forest plants, while forest plants are bad for savanna plants. This results in two alternative stable states. Both savanna vegetation or tropical forest can exist for the same environmental conditions. In a spatially heterogeneous environment, a local disturbance in a patch of tropical forest can lead to stable spatial patterns. These patterns can also adjust to climate change and create stable coexistence states that allow the ecosystem to avoid the tipping point. So, in a world with underlying variety, after a disturbance, the system isn't immediately pushed to either the savanna or the tropical forest state, but it ends up in a coexistence state. The underlying environmental heterogeneity is necessary to get this coexistence of states in one spatial domain. We still must be cautionary with changing our Earth system because tipping can still occur under certain conditions. So it is really important to consider spatial processes when studying tipping points. Research on resilience in a spatial context also shows what happens when we take away space. With limited space for natural processes, ecosystems can still tip. So, if we implement policies that allow space for natural processes, we create landscapes that are actually resilient in the face of climate change.
All right, I will continue with my presentation. Now, this video more or less set the stage for the rest of my presentation. Can you see my presentation coming up? Yes, okay. The title of my presentation being Evasion of Tipping in Complex Systems through Spatial Pattern Formation. So what I will do is I will divide this talk into three parts. First, I will talk about Turing before tipping. Then I will talk about
your presenters.
Sorry?
We currently see your presenter mode, so the three things. I think you need to switch to. So we see the sort of PowerPoint. Yeah, that would probably also work.
Like this? Better?
Yes, perfect. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, sorry about that.
Great, no worries.
So first I will talk about Turing before tipping, then I will talk about emerging resilience and evasion of tipping, and I will end up with some slides with research outlook, as we recently got an ERC project, so I will briefly tell you what that ERC project is about. So first about Turing before tipping. When I talk about Turing before tipping, I'm talking about spatial Turing patterns, and Turing being the mathematician Alan Turing, who actually invented those patterns. I will come back to that in one of the later slides. And what you see here is at the bottom panel, you see spatial simulations of a mathematical model that I will show you in a minute. And so the panels E, F, and G are basically stable vegetation patterns that emerge from the model and then become stable. And panel H is striped vegetation patterns that occur on shallow slopes in dry areas, and they slowly move upslope. So those are walking patterns, so to say. And in the upper panels, you see real vegetation patterns in dry savannas at the edge of the desert. In this case, it is in Somalia and in Niger. And they resemble closely the patterns that we simulated in the model. Now, one point I would like to make here already is that this is quite well-known stuff by now, and we think we understand these patterns that we can observe quite well because we can reproduce them by models, and if we change the parameters, it coincides with changing environmental conditions in real systems. So we are quite confident that we have quite an understanding of this system. But without the mathematics, I wouldn't even have observed those patterns. And then I specifically referred to patterns A, B, and C because the pattern in D and H, they were quite well known, but the other patterns were just unknown and not reported. And first we modeled them, and by coincidence, we got these patterns on our screen. And only after that, we could actually look for them and observe them in real systems. So to me, and I will come back to that in another incident later, mathematics is a way, actually a pair of glasses to look at the world. And if I would not have those glasses, I would just not observe everything that is out there. So the model that generates these patterns looks like this. We have a partial differential equation model in which we have plants, surface water, and soil water as three equations. And the surface water is fed by the rainfall, and the surface water can infiltrate into the soil, and the plants are dependent on soil water, as we are in this case an example of dry savannas. And the point here is that this is a simple spatial model. So surface water can move, soil water can move, and plants can move. And all of those movements we have firstly approximated by simple diffusion terms. So here you see how this model looks like. The upper equation is overland flow, which is fed by rainfall, and then the rest of the equation is what moves into the soil and becomes part of the soil water component, which is the W. And that is taken up, that soil water is taken up then by the plants. So you see the same terms in the equation of the plants, which is the uptake of the soil water. And then the plants start to grow. And the diffusion terms, they show basically the basic diffusion. And this equation actually explains in a large part the vegetation patterns that we can see in real systems. Well, how does this vegetation patterning work? This is kind of a cartoon how to explain this. So if you have a lot of plants, you have much higher water infiltration rates within those plant patches. And those rates that can be like 8 times as high water infiltration rate. So this is really a relevant process. It's not like a negligible thing. So it really increases water infiltration, and it really has an effect on the soil water below the plants. So in this way, we call this in ecology short range facilitation, because you're happy with your neighbor, because your neighbor improves your water availability for you basically, and you can grow better. But at the same time, there is a shortage of water. There's not enough water for a full vegetation cover. So the plant patches, they basically compete for the same water within that area. So that is where what we call long-range competition. So those two processes at different spatial scales actually causes these pattern formation to occur. And we call this well, this is one mechanism that falls under the umbrella of what we call in a general way scale-dependent feedback, because it's kind of a general mechanism that occurs in a lot of other ecosystems as well. And actually, what you can do is, if you analyze this model, you can also see that besides the pattern formation, there is also a tipping point and so-called multi-stability. So this is depicted in this figure, where you can see that if you move from high rainfall to low rainfall, you get first a full homogeneous vegetation cover, and then the cover basically breaks up in a spatial pattern, indicated by gamma, beta, and alpha, and you see a kind of a predictable sequence of spatial patterns before the tipping point occurs. So first, there was a lot of literature actually about ecosystems being tipping prone. And these were typically non-spatial models. But since that time, there has been many ecosystems that were first considered tipping prone. And when you look at them, you see all kinds of regular spatial patterns. So we discovered quite some ecosystems that were first considered tipping prone. And then when you look at them, you see all kinds of spatial patterns. And these spatial patterns actually resemble the patterns that Alan Turing modeled back in the 50s by inventing a theoretical chemical reaction, what he called an activator-inhibitor system. And he showed that because of diffusion and because of the differential diffusion rates of the activator as compared to the inhibitor, you can get stable spatial patterns. And at that time, that was quite revolutionary, because diffusion, by definition, would work against pattern formation. And it was only 50 years later, in the 90s, that this chemical reaction was really reproduced in the laboratory, proving Turing right with this general mechanism. And what we actually did is, by looking at those ecosystems, we actually also found a kind of a general mechanism, what we call scale-dependent feedback, which is equivalent to a kind of activator-inhibitor mechanism. And the first ecosystem that we analyzed like this are those drylands that I just started out with, in which the scale-dependent feedback is caused by the differential water infiltration and the consequential movement of water, and the resulting higher water availability close by plants and lower water availability further away. And this is causing this scale-dependent feedback in those drylands. But since then, we have discovered quite some other mechanisms that fall under the same umbrella of scale-dependent feedback in other ecosystems that are depicted here in this figure. So the general mechanism being a kind of a community of organisms that increase the resources for themselves, or they decrease the stress for themselves. And as a consequence, further away, the resources are decreased or the stress is increased. And you get this scale-dependent feedback that causes these spatial patterns to occur. And this led us to a general theory that there is many tipping-prone ecosystems, but if you look at those, you see all kinds of spatial patterns. And in the models that we analyzed, trying to model the basic processes in those ecosystems, we actually saw also tipping points and a predictable sequence of spatial patterns before the tipping points occurred. But this was back then in 2004, as you can see in this slide. So something happened between 2004 and the current times. And that is the second part of my talk, emerging resilience and evasion of tipping. And this is, again, working with the mathematicians. I work a lot with mathematicians from Leiden University. My main collaborator is Arjen Doelman, and we started to work on this even simpler model than the one I just showed. So we call this the reduced Rietkerk model, or actually better, the extended Klausmeier model, because Klausmeier came with an even more simple model that could generate these banded patterns, as you can see in this figure. The point of this model is that it captures exactly the same processes as in the three-component model, but it's more simple. So the mathematicians become more happy, and they can analyze them in a particular way that causes us to think differently about these ecosystems. And that is because of the following. That what we first thought is that this sequence of patterns that I just demonstrated was basically a predictable sequence that happened before a tipping point. But what the model analysis of that more simple model demonstrated, that those patterns could actually survive much drier conditions than we were thinking before, that the patterns were much more sticky. So actually you could change your rainfall parameters quite a bit, and the pattern would remain the same and would survive beyond the tipping point. And this is what is demonstrated here in the panel below with the so-called Boucher balloon that was also demonstrated in the video. So within that Boucher balloon, patterns can basically adapt freely and move freely by adapting their wave numbers and remain stable in time. So why is this called Boucher balloon? This is called the Boucher balloon because it was named after the physicist Friedrich Boucher, who worked on fluid dynamics and is still alive, Mr. Boucher. So actually we demonstrated also our work on the vegetation patterns, and I will show you more about that in a minute. And he was actually the discovery of the Boucher balloon in his work on convection cells in fluid dynamics. And our model actually is a very similar phenomenon, but in this case is vegetation patterns. So what we see is that these patterns are stable or sticky, as you can call it, and they evade tipping. And another thing that you can see from the Boucher balloon is that there is many stable spatial patterns with different wavelengths possible. So this also means that this has quite some implications for the dynamics of those systems where those patterns occur. And that is that the patterns can adapt quite easily. And instead of sudden transitions with a tipping point, you have more smooth, more cascading transitions. And actually, the steps of those transitions, they depend on the rate of change, and they also depend on noise, and they depend on other things. But in general, you have a much smoother transition, and you have a much narrower, much more narrow hysteresis loop in those systems. And if you look more closely to that Boucher balloon, there is two predictions you can make that basically stems from that Boucher balloon, and that is one prediction, and that in that you can have changing conditions while not changing the pattern, while the wave number remains the same. And at the same time, given a certain conditions, you can expect actually a lot of different wave numbers to be stable. So these seem to contradictory predictions, but they are actually not. They exist in the same Boucher balloon, so to say. And this is actually something that we can test in real systems if this is really occurring. And this is what we did by quite a large team of scientists, because we also, besides the mathematicians and the ecologists, we also needed the remote sensing data people on board. And what we did is we selected two areas in the Horn of Africa where these kind of vegetation patterns occur at a very large scale, and the patterns are demonstrated in the panels at the left-hand side of this slide. So these are large-scale striped patterns, and these patterns are the ones that occur on shallow slopes and move upslope, remember? This becomes relevant later in the presentation. So what we actually demonstrate, or what we can observe in those areas is pattern formation like demonstrated in this picture, in which you see actually how we interpret this as a real booster balloon in an ecosystem. Because you see one specific area, and we can assume that the environmental conditions within that area is more or less similar, meaning the rainfall would not differ a lot within that area because the area is quite spatially confined. But at the same time, you see a lot of different wave numbers of the patterns that you observe here. So this could be a real booster balloon. At least we think that this is a booster balloon in a real system, and Mr. Booster agreed with us when we showed this pattern to him. And what we can now do is we can actually validate this simple model with the data that we can get from the real system. And one way to validate this is that on the x-axis we vary slope, because within those areas, slope is the kind of environmental factor that could change. So what we then analyzed is that within a certain slope, the model predicts a whole range of stable patterns that are possible with different wave numbers. And we see the same in the real system, that given a certain slope, we see a whole range of wave numbers that are stable in the real system as well. And on a somewhat closer inspection, we have another model validation, in that with increasing wave number, both in the model as well as in the data, we see an increase in biomass and a decrease in migration speed of those patterns. And this is also that occurs in the model as well as in the real data, giving us quite some confidence that even though we have a very crude and very simple approximation of the system by only two differential equations, we still think that we capture quite the essence of these ecosystems in these simple models. So, but as you can see in this picture, a whole lot of the parameter space around the tipping point and in the rest of the figure is still white. And what we think is that there is a whole range of other possible spatial patterns that can be generated in that we call coexistence states. One of the characteristics of a system with a tipping point is that they have multiple stable states. So either the system, in this case, either the system is vegetated or the system is bare. And each system has, of course, other state variables that are relevant. But in this case, it's vegetation. But of course, within certain confined areas, you could actually see both stable states occur in one confined area. In that way, we call those states coexistence states. And what I depicted here in these panels at the right-hand side of this slide is an alternation of tropical forest with savanna. And on the lower one, it's alternation of shrubs with tundra vegetation. And those systems typically form spatial patterns in which both states coexist within the same area. And there's a whole range of plausible mechanisms that could explain that coexistence. Plus, these kind of coexistence states also can avoid tipping. For example, in ecology, there's a lot of literature on biostability and tipping points between tropical forests and savannas, and between savannas and savanna woodlands, and also between savannas and deserts. But if you look at the gradient, in this case, the rainfall gradient going from tropical forest to the desert, you don't see only an alteration of tropical forest with savanna woodlands and desert, but you see a whole range of spatial patterns occurring. And we think those patterns are either coexistence patterns or touring patterns, while the range at which coexistence patterns occur, we think is much wider and much more common than those touring patterns. And if you think about those coexistence patterns or those coexistence states, they do not only occur in ecosystems, but also in other systems. And this is a publication by Robin Bastiaansen, who was also a PhD student that worked with us. So I just talked about the savanna forest system a little bit, and also in the video you saw that, but also in atmospheric circulation, in the energy balance, in shallow lakes, but also in ocean circulation. In all of those systems, you can get coexistence states in which two stable states can coexist in the same spatial area. So we outlined the theory that we are working on at this point in a science paper a couple of years ago. And actually we are now trying to refine this theory, working on two different ecosystems that I will briefly talk about now in a couple of slides. And I depicted here also a nice picture of an ice shelf coexisting with an ocean, like the black is ocean water, the white is ice. And this is actually a picture by Karsten Eegevang, who has a lot of beautiful pictures about ice. But I like this picture because it kind of looks like a Turing pattern on an ice shelf, right? And the ice shelves coexisting with the ocean water. Anyhow, a couple of slides to go. A research outlook. So we got recently a European an ERC project awarded to further develop this theory. Basically working on two biomes, one savanna and one tundra. So we are working on those two important biomes because of the relevance also because of the threat of desertification of the savanna and the threat of strophification of the tundra, and because of those ecosystems being tipping prone, but also showing a lot of spatial patterning. So we are seeing now how we can evade and reverse tipping of these ecosystems, and we are studying pathways of resilience across multiple levels of organization. And also we think this will lead to specific ways how we can basically intervene in these systems to direct them to resilience instead of tipping. And we are studying multi-level resilience pathways. So that means we are looking at population level of vegetation, but we are also looking at individual levels and community levels, because we think all those levels interact and make the systems that we study even more resilient than we thought earlier. And finally, one very exciting topic that we will explore is, if you think about coexistence states, the boundaries between those states is a whole field of study in itself. So these boundaries can either be stable or unstable, and they can also generate a lot of stable patterns. And we think those boundaries are really important in understanding these systems, and also in designing certain human interventions, because actually we can do things with those boundaries. We can put them on fire, or we can put grazers on them. So in that way, we try to see if we can make these systems more resilient. Actually, with this ERC project, we try to develop new theory and combine them with data, with model validation, to come to a new theory of spatial pattern formation and more resilience as compared to the tipping framework that has been dominant until now. Which brings me to the conclusion slides. So we think the concept of tipping is too simplistic for spatial systems. And we think that all systems are spatial. So we think we need new concepts such as spatial pattern formation. And we show that spatial pattern formation leads to multi-stability and large-scale resilience. This having said, we are still scratching, I think, the surface of this problem only. So these results that I showed you are also dependent on other things like rate of change, like the effects of noise. There's a whole toolbox that we need to further understand and further develop this theory. And I think we need to go beyond simplicity and embrace spatial complexity to understand and predict these systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Max. That was very interesting. And also thanks for sort of going towards what you're currently working on and the most recent parts of it. Are there any questions? And please feel free to just unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, I've talked not much about climate, but I think to just kick off the discussion, I think the things that we are looking into, the different mechanisms of spatial pattern formation, the Turing patterns occurring in a small parameter range, but the coexistence patterns, especially in a larger parameter range, depending on the spatial scale you're looking at, right, is really relevant for climate system elements as well. But that's why I'm working in ecology, but I think still those insights could be general important for other ecosystems as well. Not for all, of course, but for some more than for others. Sebastian. Oh, sorry, I'm taking over the chair. You are the chair, Niklas.
That's totally fine. Go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question about that because in your examples, I guess the feedbacks the systems involved soil, moisture, and vegetation. And in a way, so the scale dependency is really a distance dependence. And I was wondering what happens if you add large-scale vegetation atmosphere feedbacks.
Yeah.
System. What happens to the Busse balloon or the solutions?
Yeah, we've done that quite some time ago in a couple of papers. The basic characteristics of the ecosystems is not changing, so you still get these pattern formations. It shifts a bit in your parameter range because the large scale affects, of course, the rainfall that's falling on the larger scale in the area. So it shifts a bit around the parameters for which you get those patterns. So it doesn't fundamentally change the things that I've just talked about, but these papers that I refer to were actually before we had the notion of the Busse balloon. Because the notion of the Busse balloon we arrived at more recently. And the papers I referred to, actually, Henk Dijkstra has worked on a paper also with coupling this system. He published that in the Journal of Bifurcations quite some time ago. And also, I did it together with Stefan Dekker as a first author, also coupling this with large-scale atmospheric circulation. Nice question. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Hannah.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for a fascinating talk, Max. So my question was about timescales. I was wondering, when you move around in this phase space, how the different timescales interact. So, for example, what's the kind of internal variability of the atmosphere timescale compared to the anthropogenic force timescale compared to the responsiveness of the vegetation?
Yeah, beautiful question. Thanks, Hannah. It's a very relevant question. I've talked about spatial scales, but not about time scales, but the time scales are really relevant. And in the systems that I work mostly on, the time scales of the water flow is really fast, and much faster than that of the vegetation, and the time of the environmental change, which is mostly rainfall in how we look at these systems, is actually quite slow. But of course, in different systems, you will get different relative timescales of human intervention versus the main processes in systems. And this is actually really, if you change those timescales, it can have a very large effect on the kind of tipping dynamics, if you wish, that is predicted. And one nice paper that I at least was a striking paper for me was the paper of Paul Ritchie. He's in the audience, I can see. Paul showed in this paper a couple of years ago beautiful what temporal scale could have for implications for this kind of dynamics. So I think actually I gave a similar talk last Friday for an audience in Utrecht. And Robin Bastiaanse was there as well, and he gave a talk about only about temporal scales. So this also is really making this quite simple, complex, or quite simple concept of tipping points much more nuanced in terms of many things can happen even if you have a tipping point in a system. A tipping point can occur as a consequence of what happened thousands of years ago. And it can take, actually, what Robin showed in that presentation on Friday is that if you get faster dynamics of the environment or conditions, then actually your tipping behavior could actually, so your fault bifurcation could actually change more in the behavior of a transcritical transition and smoothen out the tipping point. So this all is a very relevant issue that we should look further into, Hannah. There is not a straightforward answer, because every state variable in the model has its specific timescale, right? And then also the changing parameters, all the parameters in your model, all can come with specific timescales. And of course, these timescales interact. And as a consequence, you get quite a complex dynamics going on. I hope this answered a little bit your question. So basically,
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's complicated. Thank you.
Yeah.
I had another question, if I may. I think you said this Busse balloon was first put forward by someone who was studying convection. Was that
True.
convection in idealized systems or atmospheric convection?
That I would not know by heart. So you're referring to Mr. Busse, right? So I'm not really aware. In my understanding, he works on basically convection cells in water. What happens if you boil water, for example? But to be honest, I don't know what exactly systems are. But it is a fluid dynamics thing.
I'll look into it then. Thank you.
Could I quickly come back to Hannah's first question? So I find it actually very fascinating what you outlined, Max, because it's in a sense we have things are much more complicated once we add the spatial dimension, but also as we know from so in the whole context of rate-induced tipping, we know that things also become much more complicated in the sort of temporal dimension as soon as we don't have timescale separation. And if I understood you correctly, then the two things together haven't really been studied.
No. So yeah, true. So I think when I read Paul Ritchie's paper, that he was actually demonstrating the same thing for temporal scale as I was demonstrating for spatial scale, to be honest. So I think those things need urgent integration, and so far that has not been done yet. No.
Yeah, because in the sort of in the time part of the thing, it's on the one hand you can have these overshooting phenomena where you have windows of opportunity to tipping, but on the other hand you can also have rate-induced tipping, so you can basically
true.
So there you go both ways, sort of, and then
we have also published, for example, a paper a couple of years ago about how rate-induced tipping can happen as a consequence of sea level rise in salt marshes, for example. So if your sea level rises too quickly, then you can have a critical transition from a salt marsh to a mudflat and you will be drowned. But if it is not quickly, the salt marsh can keep up with sedimentation and keep up with the sea level rise. So there is a lot of work to do on the temporal scales.
Yeah. So very practically, do you think that ecosystems like the Amazon or so could sort of, I mean, given the pace of anthropogenic global warming and land use change, do you think the timescales of information are such that they could actually help with evading tipping?
That's a difficult one. I think the Amazon, as I understand it, is so heterogeneous and so diverse within the. We always look at the Amazon like as if everything is the same tree species and the same soil and the same environmental condition, but it's a very diverse kind of. I learned that also last Friday from Bernard, from this scientist from Brazil, Bernardo Flores, I think. They just published a paper in Nature about critical transition in the Amazon, and basically they showed well, the title of the paper was Critical Transitions in the Amazon, but if you look at the paper, to me it's like it more reads like a whole diverse possibility of ecosystem trajectories that we can expect in the Amazon. What worries me most in the Amazon is basically the effect of deforestation. I mean, that is if you see what humans do in that system and how they deforest and then set the stuff on fire, that to me is a big tipping point. Yeah.
Yeah, I fully agree. So next question by one of the co-authors of the paper that you just mentioned.
Oh, really?
Nyanda.
Yes, thanks a lot for the great talk. Actually, my question is about the pattern. I mean, the balloon. Is there any threshold for the spatial scale to this boost balloon? It seems like if we see some very small scale, like several kilometers, we can see very clearly about this bus balloon. But if maybe more larger scale, like regional or continental scale, maybe it's not fit for. Or if larger scale, larger spatial scale is fit for the coexistence state, like some mixture of boost balloon and like tipping point bifurcation or the multi-stable states. Is that correct?
If I understand the question correctly, so the spatial scale of the booster balloon, of the patterns in the booster balloon are of a smaller order than the coexistence ones, because actually the coexistence states in itself can lead to Turing patterns and booster balloons within the coexistence states. So those are of a smaller kind of scale than the coexistence states. That having said, of course, this is all system dependent. If you think about the AMOC, for example, or the Greenland ice sheet, we talk about much different time scales and spatial scales than if you talk about the savanna system or the Amazon. But this will depend on. I know there's some work on the AMOC and coexistence states in the AMOC. Well, those coexistence states are of an order of magnitude larger than the coexistence states in the forest and the savanna that I talked about. And I have no clue whether there can be a booster balloon in an AMOC or in another, to be honest, in another climate system element. But this kind of pattern formation is quite plausible also in other systems, because you just need an interaction of spatial stuff that moves. And if there is a difference in the diffusion rates between stuff, then it is not so difficult to get these kind of booster balloons in your system. But I think it's a nice thing to further look into, and I have no general answer on the spatial scales of those patterns in those booster balloons in other systems, because we first need to look into that.
Okay, and there's another question is about I say if I understand correctly, the coexistence states seems like a mixture of different several types of conditions, like it includes tipping points, bifurcation, or multi-stable bifurcation, or boost blue things. So is that when a system in that coexistence stage, where where this system show a reversible features, like because it already include the boost blue and other situations seems like can stable at some middle point, like Amazon maybe in some regional scale, even if the like the tree cover in close to 50% or so, but it can stable at a middle part. I mean, stable at that state, but not like a bifurcation theory. Like it will continue to move to a stable like a forest or stable at a grass, but it can stable at a middle. Is that the case too?
That is the idea that we put forward, indeed, that you can have, instead of a complete homogeneous forest or a complete homogeneous savanna, you have a mixture. And it is actually what you also see in the real system. You see a mixture at the edge between the forest and the savanna. You see a mixture of forest and savanna within specific spatial scales. And all of this, of course, is dependent on the spatial scale that you look at. And that's also something that we are looking into. What is the relevant spatial scale that you should consider if you look at a system? And so that's a very relevant question, and your analysis and the dynamics of your system is of course spatial scale dependent.
Yeah, so another relevant question is, do we have any threshold for this scale change? Like if we got some specific numbers of spatial scale that can consider about this coexistence status, maybe a more larger scale, it can only consider about tipping and irreversible thing.
Yeah, so I think there's, if I understand your question correctly, there is not a specific threshold for which you can say beyond that threshold you have tipping dynamics, and below that threshold, or the other way around, you have spatial pattern formation or something like that. I think that is all system dependent and all dependent on the main processes that you look at. But in general, what we do find is, and this is probably also an open door, that the larger the spatial scale you consider, the smoother the transitions are. But then the relevant question is, what is actually the spatial scale at which the system should be actually looked at? And that is not a straightforward question.
Okay.
But I think, we think that if you, for example, look at a savanna system or a tropical forest system, that you should look at the spatial scale that includes all the relevant spatial variation that is characteristic of that system. So meaning that you should include the spatial variation of name topography or something like that. If you only look at the top of a mountain or only at the valley, you don't have the whole system. You should look at the whole system and include spatial variation that is characteristic of that system. And if you do that, you actually move to a larger spatial scale.
Yes, thanks a lot.
Any further questions? So we don't in principle have much time left, but Max, if you allow, I would like to challenge you a little bit on this. So for the Amazon rainforest. So my understanding might be a little bit, so I might not have followed the most recent work. And in particular, I have to admit that I'm not 100% sure I understand in all detail the differences between the touring states, the coexistence states, and the Busse balloons. But be kind if my question is stupid. But so my understanding is that a lot of the work and a lot of in particular, a lot of the empirical examples for these kind of patterns come from, let's say, semi-arid, sort of in that part of the sort of water availability domain. Whereas my feeling is that if I have a possible transition between rainforest and savanna, and of course, so I mean, I mean, there's always people always in this whole tipping points context, they always talk about the drama of a rainforest savanna transition. But I sort of agree with your plan in your EFC grant that sort of saving savannas is equally important. But so for the rainforest to savanna transition, do you think that? So how strong is both the model evidence and the empirical evidence that pattern formation could sort of evade or at least extend that transition?
Yeah, thank you for this question. That's a very nice one. Yeah, what we observe now is that what we see is a lot of what we call coexistence patterns in the region between forests and savannas. So the existence of either homogeneous forest or homogeneous savanna is of course drastically reduced if you increase your spatial scale. And what you see, I don't know if you have ever looked at the Congo Basin, for example, on Google Earth, on the boundary between the forests and the savannas. You can do the same actually in the Amazon, and then especially the northern Amazon, because the southern Amazon is all human influence. But if you look at the northern Amazon, for example, Venezuela, if you look at the edges between the forests and the savanna, in Google Earth, just spend 1 hour this afternoon, something like that, and you'll see all kinds of amazing spatial patterns that you think, huh? What is happening there? You see, so I think, and we are looking into this right now, and we think that not the touring pattern so much. I think there's not much touring patterning going on in the tropical forest there and in the savannas there, but there is a lot of coexistence patterning going on there that is basically still unexplained and unexplored.
Very exciting. Then very final question. So do you think there's a chance in implementing this kind of, so basically your kind of models or the dynamics that are described by your kind of models, I think they are not implemented in the digital global vegetation models that we use inside climate or earth system models?
I don't think so, no, because the resolution of those models is just, I mean, all this takes place, I think you guys call it subgrid resolution, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a whole lot going on within the at the higher resolution, basically, in these systems that we are modeling right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and those models are plumb-based, so there is no spatial interaction in the vegetation.
Yeah, indeed, there is no. Yeah, so there is. It's a different way to look at these systems in a different kind of models, which change a bit our predictions, I think.
Yeah, great. I had a very final question. Yes, the video you showed in the beginning, is that available somewhere publicly so we could point to it on Tipping Point's website?
I think you can find it on YouTube.
Okay.
And it's on YouTube out there, so you can just Google it, and if you want, I can also send it to you. You can just I mean, you can use it and spread it. It's so if you want, I can send it.
Would be great, because I mean, we're exactly looking for these kind of sort of very instructive general public media bits. It would be really cool.
And I have to say, I have also videos about tipping points, and I have video about scale dependent feedback. They're all short, 3, 4, 5 minute videos that are very illustrative, so to say. But yes. I think they can all be found on YouTube. And if you want, I can also send it to you, Nicholas.
Great. We'll search for them on YouTube. If you don't find them, we'll get back to you.
Let me know. Yeah.
Are you okay with putting the recording of this talk on YouTube as well?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, that's
Perfect.
fine.
Great. Then
All right.
thank you so much again, Max. This was very,
You're wel-
very,
You're welcome. Thank you for listening on this Monday morning.
yeah.
And have a nice day and have a nice week.
Thank you. And to everyone else, I'm looking forward to see you again on July 1st with a talk by Stefan Hoyer on the neural GCM climate model or general atmospheric model. Thanks
All right.
and have
Bye
a
bye,
good week.
everyone.
Yes, bye-bye.